This is FreshEd, a weekly podcast that makes complex ideas in educational research easily understood. I'm your host, Will Brehm. Today we explore government taxes not as a technical economic matter, but rather as a political process that reflects social values. My guest is Elise Klein.
In terms of contribution and this role of unpaid work and the huge amounts of unpaid work that keeps society going. I mean, I think we saw that during COVID. I work a lot with folks who are experiencing poverty, who have experience living in and around the social security system. And we do a lot of work in looking at all the work that people are doing, and huge amounts of work people are doing unpaid. That's not a conversation at all. And that is a real problem. Again, when we talk about contribution and who's contributing and questions of justice around the taxation system and the narratives that are being.
Elise Klein is an associate professor of public policy at the Crawford School at the Australian National University and the co-director of the Australian Basic Income Lab. I spoke with Elise in front of a live audience at the Manning Clark House in Canberra for an event called Taxing Times. I'd like to thank Claire Manning and Luciana Todd for organizing and hosting the event. Elise Klein, thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to the Manning Clark House and welcome to the podcast FreshEd.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks for coming, everybody.
So I want to start maybe with a pretty big question that probably is rather simple, but we're going to unpack slowly. And it's actually the question that Claire ended her introduction with. Who actually contributes to tax?
Yeah. And I think, when we were talking about this conversation, this was particularly the point that I really want us to think collectively together tonight, because I think there are certain perceived wisdoms out there about who contributes, and I think it requires some significant unpacking and thinking critically. I thank you for my kind introduction. A lot of my research is contributing and support of a lot of structurally marginalised folks, and so people who often get talked about not in the same conversation as tax. And I think it's really important to think about contribution to start to close those gaps in. And so why I say that is, I will say, to answer your question, everybody contributes to tax. And whilst, income tax is the biggest, I guess, sort of revenue part of the current tax settings, areas such, and so, that I think speaks to the kinds of assumptions about who's contributing to tax. We can't forget about the GST, of course, also. But what I think is important for us to think about, and where we'll hopefully go in the conversation tonight, is to think about the tax system as part of the broader economy. And why that's important is because the taxation system, at its heart, is about funding the collective services, the collective things that we all need as human beings to exist, to stay alive, but also to exist collectively. And that can't be underestimated. The role of public education, health, Medicare, social security, pensions, all the things that we take for granted often in life that we understand as being part of society. And the tax system, is about funding that, but it's also an important role it plays in terms of redistribution. That matters because more recently, whilst that has always been the heart of the idea of the taxation system, what we've seen more recently is these kinds of narratives around that it's the rich who contributes the most to tax, and therefore because they, earn and drive the economy so much, we should limit the amount of tax those people have to pay. This kind of aspiration idea that we've got to sort of help people to aspire, because this is the sort of an interesting understanding about who drives the economy. And that's important for us because it speaks to an assumption about who's contributing. And I'd like to suggest that those kinds of narratives completely invisibilizes huge amounts of contribution more broadly. And that matters because, of course, it helps us rethink about questions around redistribution and questions of justice.
So with this narrative that the rich contribute so much to the economy, and so therefore, in a sense, it's like the government, the taxation system should get out of their way so they can drive the innovation to increase GDP. What is the distribution of the tax system when it comes to different classes of people? Like, how much are they
contributing? The rich, the poor, the middle class?
I mean, that's the point, right? Because I think it's important for us to take a step back and to think about who is contributing to the economy, to think about, so, I mean, for example, in terms of the tax system, we have revenue that comes from, say, income, so about 40% from income. GST's quite a bit less. You've got company tax that's about 19%. You've got some revenue coming from the state. But then we have to also think about the taxation system in terms of concessions as well. So thinking about it in terms of the tax and transfer system. And of course, that complicates it a little bit more too, because you have extraordinary amounts of concessions going to support. So that's sort of income foregone, if you like, into the balance sheet that are going to the top end. There's a lot of discussion about that in the public discourse around, capital gains tax, for example, around corporation tax, for example. It's a very important question that we hold all of that together when we're thinking about contribution to tax, but more importantly about contribution to the economy, who is driving the economy. And so what I would like to say is that whilst there is that narrative around, it's the rich that are creating huge amounts of money in the economy, we need to take a step back and look at quite a lot of people that are often invisibilized in those narratives. Feminists have done huge amounts of work looking for a very long time, looking at the work of unpaid care in the economy. I mean, people in this room will be very well aware that it contributes, depending on how you measure unpaid care, contributes to around about the value equivalent to about 50% of GDP. That's a huge amount of work, unpaid work that's being done that is driving and feeding the economy. And then, a couple of other areas that I work on is looking at the role of course, First Nations people. We do acknowledgement of country. It's not lost on me that we say sovereignty is never ceded. That is a political process, but it has been a fundamental economic process in understanding the Australian economy in terms of the role that a land base plays in terms of feeding the economy, but also the role of First Nations labour and unpaid labour. We can think about stolen wages for a very long time under the Protection Acts. That stolen Aboriginal labour was used by the state as a way. I work in the Kimberley. We look at the extraordinary role of unpaid labour that played in setting up the pastoral industries in the Kimberley. And, when equal wages came in and, through the referendum in the 60s, First Nations people, there was the law that they were humans now, so they had to be paid. And there was a huge pushback by the pastoralists about how they couldn't afford it because actually their industries weren't viable because they were set up on stolen labour. So that expropriation is a foundational part of those industries, but so is land. And we don't count this in the counting of what we understand as the economy.
And we'll return to some of that sort of uncounted labor and how we might reimagine a tax system or an economy if we could count it, if we could sort of bring it in. But before we do, I want to go back to this notion of what we get in return for tax contributions. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned things like the Social Security system, the pension system. And you've done some interesting work on the cashless debit card as a form or part of the Social Security system. Can you sort of take us through what this cashless debit card is and how you kind of understand it?
So compulsory income management has a long history in Australia. And to take one little step back, just to say that Social Security is often, or welfare is sort of seen as the sort of the big ticket item. Yeah, people get their tax receipts and welfare is like huge. And then people think, but people, unemployment benefits are a tiny little part of that. You've also got families, which also include maternity and paternity leave. You've got disability, and of course you've got the age pension, right? So it's a huge, really all in very, very, very important parts of what we understand as the collective society, egalitarian, social democratic society. So Social Security, though, is interesting because of those narratives around thinking about, the deserving and undeservingness, which we might come back to in a minute. And through that sort of narrative, you've seen a sort of clamping down. Isam Lay, talk just today was talking about again that the state is paying too much on Social Security support. So those kinds of narratives justify a hostility in Social Security to treat folks in extremely damaging ways. And compulsory income management is part of that. So it was introduced in the Northern Territory under the Emergency the Northern Territory Emergency Response in 2007, called the Basics Card. There's a big government evaluation on that found that it was not working in 2014. And then in 2014, Tony Abbott had Andrew Forrest, a mining billionaire, to do a review of Aboriginal employment programs. And he thought that evaluation and suggested a healthy welfare card. 100% of people's incomes would be quarantined onto a card like the Basics Card, the Healthy Welfare Card, and that would be rolled out across Australia. The government didn't call it the Healthy Welfare Card, they called it the Cashless Debit Card, and they didn't quarantine 100%, they quarantined 80% in various parts of the country. You would know that has been rolled back, and the Labor government committed to abolishing that. The Basics Card in the Northern Territory remain. And that's interesting because that is about 90% of people on that are First Nations people. A lot of those people have been on it for a very long period of time. Some even think that would include since 2007. So their whole adult lives have been managed. And there is no research to support it. There really is no research to support it. So it's a really extraordinary public policy. Over $1 billion is being spent on these compulsory income management measures, with no evidence.
What type of harms are found with these systems?
I mean, it ranges. I mean, there's, the UN and other bodies have come in to talk about the extraordinary breach of human rights, racial discrimination, of course, and then in terms of restricting people's right to social security, the government contests that and says it actually helps social security. I don't really understand that, but it's sort of, because what it does is, going back to sort of general rest of the discussion, deservingness and undeservingness, the narratives of undeservingness of people receiving social security are really powerful to allow all sorts of terrible public policies to come in to impact people's lives. And what that is doing is, people are already on very, very low incomes. This card comes in and in the case of the Basics Card, 50% of your cash is quarantined on this Basics Card. The other half of it's in your account. You can do as you like with that 50%. What's on the Basics Card is you can't take it out in cash and you can't use it for particular items. And it messes with people's money management because people are very good and effective in the country, like surviving on such low payment, trying to keep a roof over your head and your kids fed. It's an extraordinary juggle. And because you can't quite see where your money's going, it messes with how you sort of use cash, secondhand goods. It restricts your ability to get secondhand goods. And then, in terms of the division it creates in the community, which was one of the big issues around the cashless debit card, how it was implemented and how it sort of used particular leaders to tick it off and include it. Anyway, I mean, there's just a whole raft of different ways that we can sort of think about the issues of income management. But I mean, as someone that has spent a lot of time researching it, it's quite extraordinary that it still continues, given the evidence.
Maybe one way to think about it is to compare it to the way the pension system works as sort of a contrast. Tell us about the pension system and compare it to this Basics Card or this cashless debit card system.
I think what's interesting about that sort of category of welfare is the different narratives and that's something to say about the taxation system. Whilst, it's a lot of economic people use it and talk about it and do all their arithmetic around it, these are social decisions that are being made about who gets what, right? They're political and social systems. And so it should be a conversation for all of us to engage in. And Social Security, I think, is very interesting because you have these ideas, these narratives of deservingness and undeserving that follow through. And like I said, undeservingness legitimizes extraordinary policies that wouldn't be accepted for other parts of the population. That undeservingness plays out thinking about, say, less conditionalities placed on folks who are receiving the pension because, of course, very real view that people have worked all their lives and therefore they've contributed to society and therefore, they get the pension. Whereas folks who are unemployed, because of a further proximity to this idea of paid employment, seen as undeserving. And not just that, so very low payments are distributed below the poverty line for most folks. You also have these conditionalities like compulsory income management or work for the dole or other pieces. Can I just say, whilst, I think that sort of deservingness, undeservingness is very interesting and something that we really need to unpick as a society. I think it's extremely dangerous. It's also interesting to see who is not included in that conversation, right, too. And of course, the most deserving are the ones that are getting huge amounts of concessions, so revenue foregone completely, right? And which is not even on the tax receipt, which is sort of the top end of town. So pointing out the pension, but not to sort of play it off against unemployment benefits at all. I think, there's a bigger question about who's not on the sheet in terms of revenue foregone. But I will say also the other piece that I do want to sort of say is in terms of contribution and this role of unpaid work, and the huge amounts of unpaid work that keeps society going. I mean, I think we saw that during COVID. I work a lot with folks who are experiencing poverty, who have experience living in and around the social security system. And we do a lot of work in looking at all the work that people are doing, and huge amounts of work people are doing unpaid. That's not a conversation at all. And that is a real problem, again, when we talk about contribution and who's contributing and questions of justice around the taxation system and the narratives that are being told.
It seems like some of these narratives, the deserving, the undeserving, seems like there's a big issue of trust and mistrust of certain groups of citizens. But it also seems like a lot of what you're talking about, the larger sort of historical force here is sort of the settler colonial logics that this country was sort of founded on, that you might be able to see connections to even in that tax receipt that we keep pointing at over there.
Absolutely. I mean, I was actually just a couple of weeks ago reading this text by Wakefield, who was imprisoned. He's a British guy, was imprisoned for basically making this young girl marry him. And in the prison, he saw all these people also being imprisoned by the British who were there for crimes of poverty. And so he ends up penning all these random theses about dealing with the ills of of Britain's Industrial Revolution. And he writes this book called, now it's escaped me, but he calls it Systemic Colonization. And he pens this vision of what the colonies will do for Britain in terms of dealing with the social ills of people who are struggling in the Industrial Revolution, who are stealing bread, and this idea of transportation as an economic plan for Britain to deal with people that are falling off the sort of exploitation cart of, the Industrial Revolution. So he was talking very much about the need of the worker to build the settler colony in Australia. Of course, in his vision, he never talked about First Nation people. He never talked about that there was people living there and had been since time immemorial, that it was an economic plan that was taken up by the British administration to justify and to map out a economic plan for the colonies of Australia, or various colonies in Australia, but also in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So I think that's interesting because the idea of the worker and deservingness was, very much part of that. And you see that play out over time, of course, too. There's scholars that have called it the workers' welfare state, sort of moving forward quite a lot here now to the sort of post-World War II, and how fundamental labour is and thinking about deservingness as the worker. And that is fine, except that, of course, the unpaid care work of women have also played a massive role. And like I mentioned earlier, that the huge amount of, expropriation that the economy has benefited off Indigenous land and Indigenous labour. And that really can't be underestimated. This question of reparations, this question of debts owed is not a separate issue. It is absolutely part of our economic story about what the economy is and what is contributing to the economy. Yes, what we're talking about here is very much part of the settler colony. These continued logics of deservingness of what is included, but also this ever-present question of, gender and also the racialization of people.
Yeah, and it's interesting about sort of who gets counted, what gets counted as a contribution. As you're saying, there's all sorts of unpaid care labor that sort of is essential to the economy, but is not sort of acknowledged and counted in the economy. But then there's that other side of the tax concessions and the super wealthy, and that's not being counted either, even though they're sort of seen as the mega contributors to the economy, but actually it's sort of the welfare system is really designed for them in many ways.
Yes, absolutely. And I think I mean, there's different ways to look at it. There's very clear, like, how wealth is created or how is a social process that you sort of pull it back. I mean, the economists have various sort of a whole discipline that sort of thinks about things one way. But if you sort of step back and you sort of think this is a social process about what makes something valuable is a very interesting question. And there's a lot of how value is socially constructed, that you can't actually have wealth individually, like it's totally constructed. If you just allow me for a minute, I have a brother-in-law who was a football player. I know football's not that big here in Victoria and it's huge. And I could never understand how in the AFL, they get paid huge amounts of money. And what they do is they kick a ball and try and kick a ball through sticks. Like, honestly, if you peel it back, that's what they're doing. But they kick a ball through sticks and they get paid huge amounts. And they get paid huge amounts because of the 100,000 people that fill the MCG who make that valuable, right? It's same, and if you look at there's a social element that makes something valuable, right? That's what marketing does. So there's a really important argument around, do you really generate all that wealth? Really? Like, it is socially constructed. But more than that, like, I mean, even if I know that sort of, there is a very, I think, important point to be made there, but just sort of taking one step back too, thinking about wealth, and how it relies on public asset. It relies on an educated workforce. It relies on a healthy workforce. It relies on, collective services and roads, for example. Thank you, roads. Like, there's all certain ways that collectively that individual wealth is extracted or treat these things as if they're free. Of course, the ultimate one in the room is, again, unpaid care labour, that, just the role of social reproduction that builds up the next, if I can be so crass, the next group of workers, or the next, people to be educated, the next people for them to make money off. So, the role of social reproduction, of course, is another big part of that. So I think there's big questions to be asked about really, if it really should be held in the hands of very few, very, very few. But then there's this other piece which is what we're talking about tonight, around just everybody. There's so much contribution that's not being counted at all.
So maybe this is a good transition to the last part of the conversation, where we think about an alternative, right? Like, so what would an alternative tax system, contribution system look like if we actually put and center justice and acknowledge some of that unpaid care work, as well as the sort of historical legacy of colonialism and this need for reparations? How do we begin with that? I mean, sometimes it almost feels like it's too much, but, in your mind, what would be some good levers that could be pulled to make some change?
Yeah, I mean, one of the big things is when you sort of hear in the sort of public discourse around tax stuff, there's just not enough money. So, something as easy as raising the rate of job seeker, right? That would change lives. We saw it during COVID. The $550 supplement, the COVID supplement, the pulling back of mutual obligation. So it was effectively like a natural experiment of basic income, actually, an emergency basic income. Folks got money that was about the Henderson poverty line. And I mean, I did a piece of research with colleagues, with people at that time, and people reported how much their lives changed dramatically. The flick of a pen by the treasurer changed people's lives overnight, honestly. And then they took it all away, which was a cool stroke. I say this because, more recently, the Labor government's been put, you should be raising job seeker. And, they've got their committee of experts, the Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee. And the response is, we can't afford it. And that's for one, it's extremely cool to do that to a group of folks who are contributing, but also in terms of just justice, in terms of, humanity, it's quite something to keep people in such a very difficult situation. This response around there's not enough money really, is, a bit of I think this is what makes tax so important for all of us to engage in, and clearly everyone here is. because Australia is a low taxing country and there's a lot of room to move. We also rely too much, though, on income tax. I said at the start about 40% was income tax. And so there's a lot of proposals around sort of particularly a wealth tax, that we don't do that. And I mean, other countries do that. There's no, like in Norway, Switzerland, Spain, there's quite a few that are doing wealth taxes. The sky doesn't fall in. It actually services the collective supports that we require. What I'm trying to say is there's a discussion that, we can't afford these things. I think we need to first push past that. But then, and then we need to have big questions about what are the essential services, the services we want as a society. And I think we have to hold in together collectively that, the climate crisis is very real and it's changing everything. I'm sure everyone saw the terrifying report that was released yesterday in terms of what climate crisis means in terms of us here in Australia. It changes everything around, the kinds of services and supports we need to survive. So, Social Security, of course, is part of that. But there are bigger questions about reparations that I do want to end on. And I want to say that reparations are a mirror and they're a conversation. And, like I said, I'm Victorian, and there's an amazing piece of work that's just been completed in the Euro Justice Commission, Truth-Telling Commission that was Indigenous-led, first one in the country, that has done extraordinary work in terms of looking at how the colonisation, continues to play out in the present in Victoria, and and the Premier apologised. She acknowledged genocide. It's been an extraordinary process. Reparations is part of telling the truth about what our economy is. It's about holding a mirror up to the debts owed, but also the contributions and the different aspects of what we understand the economy is. And that's important in terms of, I think, justice, of course, but in terms of thinking about what life we want to have in the future, that I don't think people want to be kept into this sort of settler colonial dynamic of that we're always haunted by the fact that we're on stolen country. And so, I think these deep questions about tax, about contribution, about what the economy is, require questions of reparations to help us have those conversations more broadly, to then talk about what is it that we want this sort of bigger tax base, because we'd be taxing in a much more broader redistributive sense in terms of wealth tax. What does that money go towards? And I think reparations can be a part of that, as well as, of course, economic justice for everyone that's contributing to our society.
Well, Elise Klein, thank you so much.
Elise Klein is an associate professor at the Australian National University. We spoke at the event Taxing Times. Please note that opinions expressed on FreshEd are solely those of the host or the guest interviewed, not FreshEd, which takes no institutional position. If you've liked what you've heard today, please rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. Reviews really do help. FreshEd's team includes Fatih Akhtas, Obafemi Ongunle, Phyllis Che Mensa, and Jose Neto. Original music for FreshEd was created by Digital Primate. FreshEd is an independently run podcast without advertisements and is made possible by the support of the University of Canberra, NORAG, the Shockdev Family Fund, and listeners like you. Please consider donating to FreshEd by visiting freshedpodcast.com/support. Thanks for listening. I'm Will Brem, and I'll be back next week.